A moonless night, freezing water, a wall of ice in the dark, more than 1,500 dead, and at the center of it all, one of the greatest symbols of human confidence ever built, Titanic.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. Welcome to Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, science geek, amateur comedian. Fred, it's great to be back with you talking about real science on Friday.
Today marks the 114th anniversary of the sinking of the RMS, which is Royal Mail ship Titanic, in the waters off of Newfoundland in 1912. The Titanic is often treated like a legend and part of pop culture, but underneath all of that is a very real case study in design assumptions, materials science, cold weather physics, risk analysis, and where's Dwayne, Doug, from last week when you need him, and of course a big one, human pride and overconfidence in man's ingenuity.
Yeah, and Fred, that last part matters because one of the interesting themes of this story is how people can become overly impressed with their own technology.
Yeah, that's right. And it would only be fitting then to make sure that we look back thousands of years and compare it to God's design, Noah's Ark, which was designed to survive the worst global flood conditions imaginable. And in that particular case, Doug, the thing floats.
She floats!
Fred, only you would think on the anniversary of Titanic, hey, let's take a look at Noah's Ark. Everybody knows they're watching Real Science Radio. They're listening to Real Science Radio. So we've got the most advanced ship of the early 1900s at the bottom of the ocean. And yet we have a big wooden box from Genesis riding out a worldwide flood and landing safely somewhere in the mountains of Ararat.
Yep, and that's why we want to approach this scientifically, not with wild theories, not with, the movie mythology, but by asking some good questions. What was the Titanic actually designed to withstand? What was special about the iceberg conditions that night? What do we know about the steel and rivets? And that part's super interesting. How does cold affect materials? How does calm water affect visibility? And why were iceberg warnings not taken more seriously?
All right. So, Fred, let's start with a quick recap for all of our audience members who matriculated in the government schools. Maybe they've never heard of either of these historic events. Certainly not Noah's Ark. If you went to government school, you didn't hear about it there. But when Titanic departed from Southampton, England, on her maiden voyage, she was the largest, most luxurious, and said to be the most technically advanced ship ever to sail. It really was an engineering marvel by the standards of the day, Fred. This was not some flimsy vessel. It was nearly 900 feet long, 46,000 gross tons, and among the largest moving objects ever built at that point in history. It had enormous steam engines, a turbine, multiple propellers, wireless telegraph, and, Fred, an electrical plant aboard that produced 1.6 megawatts, which would power about 1,000 houses even today. That was more power than the average city's power plant had on board at that time.
That's fancy. That's fancy.
It had all the comforts that the wealthy classes would want, right? They had Turkish baths, swimming pools, they had a gymnasium. So to be fair, people weren't foolish to be impressed with Titanic. It really was impressive.
Yeah, it was. And, and sometimes in hindsight, people make a caricature of the past and act like these engineers were, bumbling amateurs. And we've done plenty of shows on the ingenuity of ancient man on different shows. And, these people, they were not bumbling amateurs. They were highly capable men working at the edge of what was then possible. They were cutting edge technology at the time. The ship had advanced compartmentalization. It had a double bottom. It had remotely operated watertight doors. In one sense, it incorporated a number of very sensible safety features. So the lesson here, again, is not that these were dumb people. The lesson is that even brilliant people can make assumptions that prove catastrophic when reality does not conform with the model. And as an engineer, I can say there's always going to be some number of corner cases you just are not going to account for. And it takes time to weed out all of the edge cases. A good example that comes to mind to me, Doug, is, the improved safety over time of passenger airliners. My wife kind of gets, she's like, why are you watching those shows? I like to watch those disasters of the past.
Yeah,
but they're interesting to me, where they show all the science behind figuring out, what's happened. But over the decades, it's become so much safer as they start fixing all of these little corner cases.
Right,
and
right.
There's always going to be these edge cases with engineering.
Mm-hmm. And bringing an engineer's mind to it, Fred, that this should be a lot of fun. And now this contrast especially should be interesting for Christians, because the Bible also gives us the story of a ship, right? But it's a very different one. Noah's Ark, it was not a monument to human prestige or luxury. It was a survival vessel that was built to God's specifications. And in fact, Fred, in the 1990s, a team of South Korean researchers in naval architecture, they actually studied the ark's proportions for structural safety, stability, and seaworthiness, seakeeping, they say, in the waves. And their conclusion was that the biblical proportions were extraordinarily well suited for survival at sea.
Yeah, and if I remember that study and others, there's been others like it. You could take that tsunami, that really bad one from a decade or so ago near Indonesia, and you could amplify that, and you still couldn't sink the ark based on the dimensions that were given in the Bible. So this thing was definitely very well engineered to survive all kinds of turbulence, which we would have had in a huge, gigantic global flood. So that is a really striking contrast, Doug. The Titanic represented elite confidence in modern engineering at the time, while the ark represented humble obedience to God's instruction. And, interestingly, the ark's proportions, they were not optimized for speed, beauty, or maneuverability. I'm pretty sure that there wasn't this elaborate, beautiful staircase in the middle of the ark that goes up to the first class cabins.
No.
They were optimized for stability and preservation of life. And that's just a very different design philosophy.
Right, right. And I remember those compartments were, on the Titanic, those were a big selling point from the structural engineers. The watertight compartmentalization, they were like, hey, even if it floods compartment after compartment, it won't sink. And Fred, the problem was it was designed to survive for maybe even 5 flooded compartments from what I've read, but the iceberg damaged about 6. And worse, the bulkheads didn't go high enough. So once the water came in, then the ship's angle changed, and then it just spilled from one compartment to the other, like if you tipped up an ice cube box.
Yeah. And, I saw a demonstration on YouTube, a guy who built a replica, and he was actually able to get this replica to sink on the 5th compartment being compromised. And yeah, it just shows you how good of an engineer this Thomas Andrews was to be that spot on. He knew exactly what was going on. He designed the boat, and he knew that, okay, after the 5th one, when he knew that it was 6, he was like, it's a mathematical certainty that this thing's going to sink. I mean, that's a line right out of that James Cameron Titanic movie.
But this ship can't sink.
She's made of iron, sir. I assure you, she can. And she will. It is a mathematical certainty.
And, we don't know that he said that, but he would have definitely thought it. He definitely would have conveyed, hey, this thing's going down. You better get distress signals going out.
Yes, I think Ismay reported in his testimony, the survivor's testimony before Congress, that he did say this ship will sink within 1 to 2 hours. The engineer who designed it said. Yeah, we've got one, maybe 2 hours.
He went down with the ship.
Yeah, yeah.
And, I always thought it was interesting, Doug, that if the ship had hit the iceberg dead on, it very likely wouldn't have sunk. Now, it would have killed people who were in the front, obviously. But So, and also the other thing, speaking of icebergs, and we'll talk about the iceberg physics now. When people think of iceberg, they picture something like a floating mound of snow or this floating rock, but it's not fragile stuff. It's glacial ice. It's heavily compacted, incredibly dense, and there's a tremendous amount of mass or iceberg below the surface. Generally, there's only about 10% of an iceberg visible above the water. So there's a much more of it underneath the water.
Yeah. And Fred, you mentioned that if it would have hit it straight on, this is another one of those little factors that it's really hard to, had the engineers been thinking it through, they would have thought, well, if we see an iceberg, surely we're going to turn to one side or the other. So we really need to make the sides really, really strong. But they weren't thinking through what happened that night. They were just thinking through various possibilities and maybe looking back at the history of how ships had sunk before. And it's just like you have said before, Fred, all models are wrong. Some are useful. And you just can't model to every little, anyway. Yeah. But icebergs, Fred, it's not like a chunk of ice like in the kitchen. A large iceberg it's not just cold water in a different form. It's this massive mechanical object. I mean, its size, its rigidity, and the underwater profile you mentioned, that matters a lot. Even if the visible portion didn't look huge from a distance, the submerged mass underwater, it could reach down and out in ways that make it way more dangerous for a ship's hull than the observer at the surface might assume. And if you remember, Fred, there had been reports of ice in the area. Conditions had apparently contributed to a more southward iceberg presence more than usual. The hazard was known. Warnings had been transmitted, but then the question becomes, under those conditions, how easy was it to actually detect the iceberg in real time?
Well, so Doug, you said, do you remember, Fred? Well, I don't remember in 1912 because I wasn't alive, so I don't know what you're implying there, but I do remember the various movie accounts, like the Hollywood Titanic movie that we referred to earlier. Yeah. I'll never let go, Jack.
I'll never let go. I promise.
Anyways, regarding visibility, this is where some of the physics, believe it or not, gets really interesting. So on the night of the Titanic struck the iceberg, the sea was unusually calm. And at first glance, that might sound like a good thing. No storm, no giant waves, no high winds. But calm water can actually make iceberg detection harder at night. When there are waves, they break around the base of an iceberg and they can create visible white water. That gives observers a clue even before the full shape is visible. But if the sea is flat calm, that visual signature is largely absent. And to the lack of moonlight, the iceberg becomes much harder to distinguish from the darkness around it. Again, there is no moonlight that night. So you have this eerie combination, a dangerous object, a black night, and no helpful wave action to reveal the threat. Next thing you know, there's iceberg ahead. I need more power, Captain. I mean, they just had so little time.
Yeah.
So little time. If I recall, I think they had like 1 kilometer and, the ship barely starts turning at about a half kilometer, and they had no chance of not side scraping that iceberg.
It's a good reminder, Fred, that human perception is limited. I mean, and by the way, Fred, we talk about human perception and vision as if seeing is simple, but it's not simple. Vision depends on contrast, edges, motion, background illumination, and expectations. And the lookouts, they weren't scanning a brightly lit harbor. They were peering into the black, cold dark, trying to detect a dark object against a dark background with very limited optical cues. And there's another lesser known possibility here, Fred. Some researchers have suggested that unusual atmospheric conditions were present that night, and they may have caused a kind of a kind of an optical distortion, basically bending light in a way that made it even harder to see until the iceberg was very close.
Yeah. So, they were operating at near the limits of human visual detection. And, that ought to affect how we think about the ship's speed, because a vessel moving quickly in a known ice region at night is relying heavily on early detection. And if early detection is impaired, then speed becomes a much more serious variable. Honestly, we're not even sure that if they had binoculars, would that have, made a difference? Maybe. But who knows, Doug?
Yeah. Well, the bottom line is they did have intel on icebergs in the water, but they steamed ahead full. Apparently there were, like scheduling pressures, the prestige of maintaining the progress of the ship, and the confidence that they had in the ship, confidence in their lookouts, maybe overconfidence in the conditions it was so calm. Perhaps it was just a combination, Fred, but whatever the psychological reasons, the simple physical reality was this: the faster the ship traveled, the less time they had between detection and impact.
Yeah, and that's another key point for listeners. Speed doesn't just increase impact energy, it also reduces decision time, as you said. It compresses the whole chain of human response. Detection, recognition, communication, helm action, engine response, ship inertia, turning radius, all of that gets squeezed. So even a few extra knots can make a significant difference in whether you miss a hazard, glance it, or strike it.
Yeah, well said.
So, the Titanic it's a really large ship with tremendous momentum. Even after the lookout spotted the iceberg and the warning was relayed, the ship could not pivot like a speedboat. It's not a, what are those things called? PT boats?
Yeah, no.
This thing was huge, especially in its day. I mean, current cruise liners are much bigger, but this is still nevertheless a really big ship. People, they sometimes imagine a steering wheel and instant response, but that's not how a vessel of that scale behaves. And so, Doug, once the iceberg was finally seen at close range, the available options, they just were constrained by physics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I want to look at what the collision actually did, because I know that's always really interesting. What was the damage? Is there science we can look at behind that?
Yeah, because we've seen the wreck, right? I mean, there has been some analysis of the damage, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of new interesting stuff. So,
yeah.
But before we do that, Doug, we need to do our interesting fact of the week.
Oh, I thought I heard you going that way. That's why I was trying to come up with an interesting question. All right, Fred. The interesting fact of the week. Okay.
Okay, here's the interesting fact of the week. Why did the Titanic leave behind shoes and clothing, but no bones?
No bones?
No bones.
So you're saying when they found the wreck in 1985, they located shoes and clothing, but no bones?
Yeah, and in the areas where they thought, okay, that the bones would have been there. It's not like the shoes floated off.
Okay. Well, I mean, the only obvious thing I can think of, Fred, is that sea creatures ate the bones.
I can maybe give you a partial credit for that one, because so you're partially right. Okay.
Okay. It's not going to be fish, is it?
Well, so I'm very trigger happy with the orange little button here. So basically, deep sea scavengers, like tiny crustaceans and amphipods, they're going to strip away the soft tissue very quickly. I mean, I've got in my saltwater tank, I've got a cleaner crew, they're called, like snails and clams and whatnot, and they clean your tank. Same thing in the deep sea. You've got cleaner crews, like these crustaceans and amphipods. They'll just demolish whatever soft tissue's around. And they do it, literally, they can do it in just days. But that's not really what got rid of the bones. And that's why I was, very happy to hit the orange button here. So basically, over time, the chemistry of the deep ocean finishes the job. So the water is slightly acidic and low in the minerals needed to preserve bone. So it actually pulls calcium out of the skeleton. There's an imbalance of calcium carbonate. So we could get into all kinds of chemistry here, but basically the bones just slowly dissolve. And I saw one analogy. It's like if you've got a cup of coffee with a lot of sugar in it, you put more sugar. The extra sugar doesn't dissolve right away because there's already sugar in the coffee. But if you put sugar in coffee that doesn't have sugar, the sugar is going to dissolve pretty quickly. So in an environment in the deep sea like that is lower in calcium carbonate, the surrounding chemistry is just going to want to absorb, those bones. And so it doesn't take long. It's not days, it's longer, but it'll definitely pull the calcium out of the skeleton over time.
Well, Fred, that's interesting. That brings up another interesting Bible fact. I know in the Bible, God says at the end, he's going to bring up all the dead from the sea. Even though their bones aren't even there. So that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Now, let's get back to the Titanic. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to take a partial credit on that and that some creatures might have been responsible for some of that. Okay, I'll take whatever I can get, Fred. But let's get to this. There's this persistent myth. In fact, it's what I thought, Fred, was that this iceberg just ripped a giant gash through the side of the ship, like a knife opening up a can. But that's not really the best understanding anymore, is it?
The evidence suggests the damage was more like a series of smaller openings and deformations along the hull seams over a stretch of the forward side. So that distinction matters because it changes how we picture the flooding. It wasn't necessarily one huge open wound. It was a distributed failure across multiple points, enough to admit water into several compartments that you referred to earlier. This new technology of compartments in the ship that was supposed to make it unsinkable. So for the ship's design, that was exactly the kind of multi-compartment flooding scenario that it could not ultimately survive.
So we see again, Fred, basically a theme of cumulative failure. A lot of disasters, not one spectacular break. They're the accumulation of several smaller failures together across a threshold of time. And each breach, pretty modest in and of itself, but in combination, they become lethal.
Yeah, and I know Dwayne would be just chomping at the bit if he was around at the Titanic to be doing his failure analysis. So distributed damage can be especially dangerous because it affects multiple safety zones at once. If all the damage had been concentrated in one place, the flooding would have been contained. But by extending damage across too many compartments, the collision defeated the ship's compartment strategy. So in a sense, the pattern of the damage mattered as much as the size. And I just can, this designer of the Titanic, I can just imagine when he's designing it, he's probably not thinking of what are the odds of something scraping along and taking out all these compartments on one side, because he'd probably even be thinking maybe even I don't know if they even had invented torpedoes back then, but hitting something, you just kind of picture, okay, something rams into it.
Yeah,
it's not going to sink. Yeah. But you think of these scattered holes down the front side of the ship that just gets to that fifth one and then the sixth one, it just makes it impossible to stay afloat.
Yeah. And that brings us now, Fred, to one of the more scientific aspects of the whole story, the materials. People often assume, hey, steel is steel, as if all steel behaves always the same, but that's not how material science works, especially in cold temperatures, right?
Yeah, Superman, the Man of Steel, he had his kryptonite. Well, steel has its kryptonite. And so the steel used in 1912 was not identical to the modern shipbuilding steel. Its material composition, manufacturing methods, impurity levels, and toughness all matter. And one of the key concepts here, Doug, is brittleness at low temperatures. A material that performs adequately in warm conditions may behave much more poorly in cold conditions, especially under impact loading. Rather than deforming plastically and absorbing energy, it may crack or fail more abruptly.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And from what I understand, some analyses of steel that was actually recovered from the Titanic indicated that it had properties that made it less tough in icy North Atlantic conditions, less than modern steel would be. There's issues like higher sulfur and phosphorus content compared to what you'd want today. And the material was more susceptible to brittle fracture.
That's right. And I want to play a quick video from Yale Labs on this very thing.
The seawater was 28 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 2 degrees Celsius. These temperatures are colder than freezing. Now, had the Titanic been in slightly warmer waters, the metal would have been ductile, so a collision with the iceberg would have caused a dent or buckling, sort of like you would see in a car accident. But at those frigid temperatures, the metal acted like it was more like an eggshell. Now let's look at this behavior in action. I want to show you how you can drastically change a metal's properties based on the temperature it experiences. Now this is not exactly what happened to the Titanic, but you'll see a drastic effect. Here I have a bobby pin. It's made out of high carbon steel and it's very, very flexible. Let's see what happens when I heat this up and then cool it very quickly. All right, let's do that. I'm going to heat it to red hot with this blowtorch, and then we're going to quench it in the water. Let's see what happens. You see it's red hot. Quench it in the water. Now, let's see what happens if we pull this apart. Wow, that took almost nothing.
So for those listening on the radio, she took the bobby pin and just easily pulled it apart. Didn't have to do anything. I mean, it just shows, Doug, how brittle it was.
Mm-hmm.
It's fair to say that the materials were less forgiving under cold impact conditions than in modern marine engineering. We've gotten better at metallurgy and all this stuff. So, and then, Doug, you have the rivets. They were really critical, some of which they may have been wrought iron with slag inclusions and varying quality. And if those fasteners fail under stress, plates can separate or distort more readily. I saw one YouTube video, and it's kind of like a zipper just coming apart and ripping apart all those rivets, bursting out.
Yeah, and that's fascinating, Fred, because now the story becomes more nuanced. It wasn't that the iceberg sliced cleanly through the hull, like a razor. It may be that the collision caused these seams to pop open, rivets to pop, local failures, and then they propagate in through the brittle metal in a piecemeal way, and which is exactly the sort of thing a layman would not imagine, but Fred, an engineer or a materials scientist, would appreciate that.
Yeah, and I wanted to expand a little bit more on this point about materials. So people sometimes think as though steel is practically invincible, but as we've shown, steel has environmental limits, and in the Titanic's case, cold made the whole materials and rivets less forgiving under impact. And if you recall the World Trade Center investigations, Doug, I found that really interesting. They found that at very high temperatures, steel experiences major loss of strength and stiffness, and this came from NIST. And that thermal expansion also played a major role in failure behavior. So I wanted to show this next video, and this thing went viral, and it shows exactly what steel does at very high temperatures to, again, give a picture of how steel behaves at the different varying temperatures. So let's take a look at this video.
And I want you to see something very interesting. Go into the forge. It's very hot, but not melted. Obviously, it is not melted. I put this in the oven. Now watch this. I'm going to take my pinky finger, half-inch solid steel. Check it out. It's a freaking noodle. Your argument is invalid. Get over it. Find a job.
So, for those who can't see the video on the radio, I definitely highly encourage you to go check out our show on YouTube and watch this. He shows this, this pipe where he can just bend it back and forth really easily. And then that would explain when those pillars in the World Trade Centers reached a certain temperature. After a while, that steel is just going to give way, that it just isn't steel anymore. Basically, it's not, solid and rigid. It's flimsy.
Right. And it all gave out at the same time. And I remember I watched that on TV, live. Yeah.
Yep.
Wow. Steel is strong, but only within certain temperatures and loading conditions. Extreme cold can be bad. Extreme heat can be bad for metals. It's an excellent point, Fred, because it reminds people that materials aren't magic. They obey the laws that God created. And the same basic truth applies when we think about Noah's Ark, Fred, and the gopher wood. We don't know exactly with certainty what gopher wood was. The Hebrew term only appears that one time in the Bible, and leading lexical sources admit that the exact species is unknown, though cypress wood is often suggested. So we should be careful not to overclaim what we know. But whatever that wood was, Fred, it was evidently suitable for a massive vessel. And Genesis also says the ark was covered in pitch. You remember that? Like tar, which would have contributed to waterproofing.
Yeah. Yeah. And it gives us one more scientific lesson here. Design is not only about the blueprint. It is about the actual physical properties of the materials under the actual environmental conditions that they'll face. And that's true of bridge design, aircraft, medical devices, and buildings, as it was in the 1912 shipbuilding.
Yeah. And Fred, when we talk about Titanic, one of the most sobering realities is what happened to people who ended up in the water. Because this wasn't just cold water, Fred. This was near freezing North Atlantic water, about 28 degrees Fahrenheit. I know that sounds like it's below freezing, but we have to take into account the salt water content just below that freezing point, that normal freezing point for salt water.
Yeah, that's cold. And, at that temperature, Doug, survival isn't measured in hours. It's measured in minutes, literally. And the science of what happens to the human body in cold water, it's pretty well understood today. And there are essentially 4 stages that happen rapidly. The first is what's called cold shock. When someone suddenly enters water that cold, the body triggers an involuntary gasp reflex. People literally gasp uncontrollably, and if their face is underwater when that happens, they can inhale water immediately. The heart rate spikes, blood pressure jumps, and some people, they can even go into cardiac arrest within seconds.
Yeah, and Fred,
this is I would have.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, I have some friends who did the polar plunge in Boulder. They sent me the video. This isn't the polar plunge. This, where you dip in, and you breathe deep and you get out and you tell everybody how you got this endorphin rush. And, this was near freezing North Atlantic water. And at that point, Fred, going in from the Titanic, it's not like, oh, yes, this is great for my health. This is like, oh, I'm in mortal danger. Your body responds.
Yeah. I've got friends that do that cold plunge, Doug. It seems to be a fad, but honestly, there's good science behind it. I mentioned this to a couple that we met from Canada when we were on my wife and I were on our trip to Mexico. And they had no idea that, when you compare a cold plunge to, drinking coffee, the cold plunge has a much more lasting effect throughout the day. I mean, I think it's 4 or 5 or 6 hours you get out of this big endorphin rush. And just the science behind it. And they're like, oh, interesting. I think we're going to go take a cold plunge,
Okay.
And, speaking of coffee, by the way, Doug, right here, I've got my RSR coffee mug.
Yeah.
And if you want one of these, by the way, we're going to have these available in our store. But more importantly is what is inside of it. And this is my favorite coffee. It's Door County Coffee. And I actually love mentioning these guys because I don't have to pretend. I don't have to, oh, well, yeah, we're going to mention these guys because, I don't have to. This is really true. This is my favorite coffee before I ever even talk to these guys.
That's right.
Door County Coffee. It's really good stuff.
We're not slaves to corporate sponsors. We just like Door County Coffee. My cup's full of it too, Fred.
Good. That's right.
All right, let's get back to hypothermia, though. Stop enjoying that coffee. What about hypothermia?
Many people think of hypothermia that it's the first danger, and it's not. It's the first danger is that initial shock. Your breathing becomes erratic and you lose control. Even strong swimmers can drown in the first minute if they panic or inhale water.
Well, see, Fred, I immediately was thinking hypothermia, just like you just said. That's the first thing you think of. But so now I've been educated as we prepared to do this show, looking at the Titanic scientifically, looking at the Titanic compared to Noah's Ark. And when it comes to getting into that super cold water, there's that first initial, it's called cold. Well, after that initial shock, then you get into what's called cold incapacitation. Within just a few minutes, the nerves and the muscles in the arms and legs, they begin to fail. You lose strength, Fred. You lose coordination. You lose dexterity. So even if someone avoids that initial gasp and that inhalation of air, even if they stay afloat, they may no longer be able to swim, or even keep their airway above the water.
Yeah. So then after that, hypothermia begins to set in more deeply. So we know about like how the body's core temperature, it'll start dropping below the normal 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit that we're all familiar with. That's supposed to be the normal temperature. When you got a fever, you're like around 100. You want to be around 97, 98. So as it drops into the low 90s and then to the 80s, mental confusion sets in, then loss of consciousness, and the heart rate becomes increasingly unstable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in water this cold, Fred, the whole process can happen very quickly. Estimates suggest that in 28 degree Fahrenheit water, Fred, a person might lose useful motion in 5 or 10 minutes, and unconsciousness can follow not long after that. And just to put that into perspective, in water that cold, Fred, even wearing a life jacket, it may not save your life if you're not in a boat. It keeps you afloat, but it doesn't keep you warm.
Yeah. And, when I think back at, the different depictions in that, the big Hollywood movie, there really wasn't there wasn't much point of people running around, with a life jacket on. It's not going to save their lives. It might prolong it by maybe a minute. I don't know. I think based on knowing this, would I even put on a life jacket if I'm in a ship that's going down in 28 degree weather? I don't know. I just might. Well, why waste my time?
Why drag it out?
Yeah. What a complete waste of time.
What a waste of time.
And then there's also people who were rescued. There's the post-rescue collapse. And sadly, many Titanic victims never reached, they survived, the water, but then they really didn't. Later on, people who were rescued from the cold water, the body can still fail because of sudden changes in blood circulation and temperature.
Yeah, I read about a handful of victims that they were recovered by the Carpathia. And at least one of them seems to have died after the rescue, rather than before. And that's consistent with what modern medicine calls what you just said, Fred, post-rescue collapse. And now the records from 1912, they don't use that term. It wasn't around back then. So when we say the water was deadly, even though they didn't have a diagnosis for it, you could die even if they got you out of the water. Just the shock and the environmental pressure on your body, you could just die from what's a lot better known right now, friend. So when we say the water was deadly, I mean, that's not an exaggeration. This was an environment where without a lifeboat, flotation support, your survival odds were slim to none.
Doug, and when researching for the show, I came across the story of Archibald Gracie, who survived the sinking, but later died that year after he really never fully recovered from the ordeal. And it shows how severe the bodily toll can be even beyond that immediate rescue window. So this again was like about a year later.
Yeah,
never fully recovered.
Well, hey, Fred, that brings us back to another rather profound thing about Noah's Ark. Noah's Ark was designed to keep people out of the water entirely during a global catastrophe. And with that enormous subterranean water release and a violent geological upheaval, I mean, Noah wasn't surviving just a gentle rise in water level. He was surviving a planet-wide hydraulic catastrophe. And if you want to know more about it, you can order the 9th edition of Walt Brown's In the Beginning if you want to see just how catastrophic it was. And if you're into the math and the science and you want to find out all about the physics of what occurred, what likely occurred, well, check out the 9th edition. You can pre-order it, by the way. Anyway, Fred, but Noah's Ark.
Hey, Doug, let's what's an update with the 9th edition? We know it's been delayed, but we're thinking it's finally going to arrive in about the June timeframe.
June, yes. I was hoping for D-Day, the 6th of June, but it may be more like the 15th. But we hope to start actually shipping the books out mid-June.
Yeah, we will be including in that RSR's first book that we've produced, a new teaching series that we've started. And the first book is Jesus, Light, and Design. And we will include this book for all those who pre-order Walt Brown's In the Beginning. And we apologize again for the delays in getting this shipped out, but there's been issues and they're resolving them. And so, yeah, I think it's happening this time. Look for June, and hopefully that date won't slip.
Yes. And just be patient. I mean, the world is almost 6,000 years old. So come on, give us. It'll be a few more weeks. We'll get to it.
There you go.
But anyway, Fred, you talk about these poor souls in the cold water, and we think about Noah's Ark and just the difference, you know. You can survive the environment if you're not exposed to it, and that's what Noah's Ark accomplished.
Yeah, the Ark wasn't designed to help people survive in the water. It was designed so that they never had to be in it, in that global flood. So
and Fred, we should also mention that just briefly at the later discovery of the wreck, you know, 1985, I think it was, that really opened up a whole new chapter of scientific understanding. When Ballard and his team found the wreck, 1985, they were able to confirm and refine a great many theories about how the ship, did it break apart, did it not, how did it end up settling on the ocean floor. All that was solved not long thereafter.
Yeah, and it really opened up a whole nother layer of science, you know, this deep ocean environment. You know, you have immense pressure, darkness, corrosion, microbial activity that we've talked about before, and the gradual decay of what once seemed so permanent. And the wreck itself became a kind of time capsule, but also a reminder that even our grandest works return to dust and rust. And there's a humbling quality to that image, the mighty Titanic sitting in silence at the bottom of the Atlantic, being slowly consumed.
Right. And Fred, I mean, back to the interesting fact, even all that has some scientific richness to it. The bacteria feeding on the iron and the formation of rusticles and the collapse of the structure slowly over time. It reminds us that the creation is active, it's dynamic, and it's subject to decay. Nothing material, Fred, is eternal.
Yeah. There's the different Bible verses on, basically the second law of thermodynamics about, we're in a state of decay, right? The creation moans and travails.
Yeah.
So, and it fits with our understanding as Christians, a biblical understanding of a fallen world. We can build, discover, invent. We can do all kinds of impressive things and all good things. But, all of our works, they're finite. They are subject to corruption, entropy, as I mentioned, decay, and judgment. And the Titanic is a vivid monument to that reality of just comparing, as we've done, man's ingenuity compared to God himself. And it's just, you look at the Ark and you compare it to the Titanic, and it kind of gives that image of what we're talking about.
Yeah. And Fred, it kind of gives you the big picture. And when we step back from the details, well, I'll just ask you, Fred, what do you think the biggest lesson here is? Because there's a lot of candidates. better materials, more lifeboats, slower speed, take the warnings more seriously. I mean, all of those are true, Fred.
I think the biggest lesson is humility, before reality. The Titanic was not sunk by one cartoonishly foolish mistake. It was brought down by a web of understandable but inadequate assumptions, just a wide combination of errors as we've covered on this show. And people trusted in the design. They trusted the procedures. They trusted the conditions. And, I read this one account that I hadn't heard before. Is in the movie, it depicts like, we want to get to New York really quick. It's almost like we want to set records, this and that. And one account said that they thought it was more likely that the captain was just so confident in this ship being unsinkable. He just was okay with keeping it at full bore ahead, even though they had all of those, iceberg warnings. He trusted the reputation of the ship, and he trusted human progress. But, reality does not bend to confidence. The iceberg was what it was, The steel is what it is. The water temperature was what it was. The darkness, all of those things. The laws of buoyancy, motion, fracture, and heat transfer were what they were. And once those realities converged, no amount of prestige or just man's ingenuity could stop them.
Yeah. It's a powerful lesson, Fred. It reminds me that, true science, real science, as we like to say here on Real Science Radio, it ought to produce humility, not arrogance, because the more you understand the real world, the more you realize that there are layers upon layers of factors that are all interacting, many of which we don't fully understand, let alone control, Fred. Real science just doesn't justify pride. It reveals complexity, dependence, limits, and our need for wisdom.
Yeah. And I love that part about wisdom, because one of my favorite verses in the Bible, when I first started really becoming interested in reading the Bible instead of just, doing the Creaster thing back when I was a Catholic going to Christmas and Easter. And, I reached a point in my life I started getting a little bit more serious. But I remember my favorite verse that really stuck out to me at the time was, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Wisdom, yeah.
So, we are called to subdue the earth, yes, but not to imagine ourselves as something independent of the Creator. And I mean, we just do that way too much. Man just loves to do that. And they forget that distinction. And progress becomes a form of idolatry, really. And the Titanic was, in a sense, a floating sermon against that kind of pride.
Yeah. Hey, and Fred, that's probably why you thought of comparing it to Noah's Ark for this broadcast. I mean, one vessel became a symbol of human confidence, and it went down on its maiden voyage. The other was built according to God's warning and God's measurements, by the way, and it preserved life through the judgment. One was celebrated by society. The other was mocked by everybody in the world. But in the end, the one that God built was the one that endured.
That's right. We're called Real Science Radio, Real Science. So even scientifically, that contrast holds up better than people realize. The Ark's proportions, as we mentioned, they've really been seriously studied by naval engineers, and they make a ton of practical sense for a giant survival vessel. And the Titanic, on the other hand, it reminds us that even sophisticated design can fail when pride narrows the safety margin. And the Ark reminds us that obedience to God is not anti-science. In this case, it turns out to be deeply consistent with sound design, which we love to talk about on Real Science Radio.
Amen, yeah. And Fred, by the way, speaking of a giant survival vessel, the gospel, Jesus died for your sins. Trust him. You can survive all this, but that's the only vessel, is you need to get in on that. Trust Jesus to forgive your sins. He rose from the dead to freely offer you eternal life. There's I'm throwing out a life preserver right there, Fred. But back to the tragedy of the Titanic. I mean, even in the midst of all that tragedy, Fred, there were acts of courage and sacrifice and duty and honor. So the story isn't only about failure. It's also about the image of God in man showing through in a really horrible moment.
Wow, what a great point. And, this is a good thing to end the show on, the gospel. But to your point there, even in this catastrophe, there were men and women acting with bravery, sacrifice, love for others. So we don't tell the story merely to condemn the past. We tell it to understand it, to learn from it, and to remember that man is both capable of great achievement and deeply in need at the same time of humility before God.
Yeah.
And again, that's a good picture, Doug, of, we're created in the image of God, and we did see that shining through also in that terrible moment.
Yeah. And, well, that's a fitting note to end on, Fred. One of history's great disasters, but also one of the great case studies in engineering, materials, perception, risk, and especially worldview. In fact, Fred, according to many reports, the orchestra kept playing at least right up until the last survivors got on the lifeboats, if not to the very end. And it's generally accepted that the song they played at the end was in fact an old hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee."
All right, well, let's play that and close the show. So for Doug McBurney, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.